I'm President's Professor of Urban Ecology here at LMU and Executive Director of the LMU Center for Urban Resilience, and we're delighted to be co-sponsoring with the Academy of Catholic Thought and Imagination this roundtable this afternoon. This really is an extraordinary event, and it's one of three that we are planning to co-host throughout the year that will allow us to engage and use as a tool moving forward this extraordinary document that is the most recent Pope's encyclical. You know, for me, at the advanced age that I am, I tell my wife that I'm out of warranty, but I still have the extended service plan, so hold on to me for a while longer. I remember back to my graduate school days in the 1980s. I'm an environmental scientist. I did my doctoral studies before urban ecology was a standard word, but we were concerned about sustainability, and we were concerned about what resilient communities look like in this age of massive urbanization. And when we would stop at all to ponder what the Catholic Church or the Pope had to say about science, mostly we quaked in our boots and thought about the Pope's relationship to previous scientists like Galileo, whose relationship was troubled, to say the least, and has become part of historical lore. But we know that there's been tremendous change in the centuries that have followed. And we know that as communities of faith and as profound institutions like LMU and its sister and brother Jesuit institutions, we have found a way to work as scientists and members of a variety of faith community to be organizations of action. And the different ideas that compel us to action do not limit the communities that we will partner with to achieve those desired and shared outcomes. And this latest encyclical charges us to do nothing less than, in fact, accelerate that process. And so for me, as a scientist who's blessed to be able to work at a Jesuit university, I feel that this is not only a profound call to action, but a roadmap and a challenge for us to meet and a way for us to think about our vocational discernment as both professionals and students at LMU. I'm particularly excited to see all the young faces in the crowd, students here. And remember those three Jesuit questions that you're asked about your planning of the future. What do you love? What are you good at? And what does the world need? And it's at the intersection of those three questions in your own vocational discernment that you will find joy. And I'm careful to separate joy from happiness, because sometimes doing the thing that is right doesn't make you happy, but it is joyful. And I think this encyclical provides us an extraordinary roadmap to where the discernment of joy leads. And it's around the care of the earth. It's around responding to our own anthropogenic impacts. And it's about thinking of those less fortunate than us who have suffered the consequences of the kind of impacts that we've had on the earth. Some have benefited greatly, billions have suffered. So how do we as a community of spirit and scholarship and a variety of communities of faith respond to that? And the encyclical provides an extraordinary document for us to ponder, and that is part of our task today. I've also had the great joy and happiness of serving on the advisory committee for the new Academy of Catholic Thought and Imagination. And we are so thrilled that we are now in operation. And at the Center for Urban Resilience, we can share the opportunity to conjoin our missions. And I am incredibly thrilled to introduce the new director of the Academy of Catholic Thought and Imagination, Dr. Brian Train.
I'm going to say a few brief words, but because this is the first event that the Academy is sponsoring after the launch event last spring, I do want to take a moment to say a quick bit about our mission, and then I'll quickly introduce our panelists, and we'll get right to the meat of why we're all here tonight. The Academy for Catholic Thought and Imagination was launched last year at a really successful event in the spring, for those of you who were here. It was an initiative sponsored by our former president, David Burcham. We at the Academy see ourselves as serving a variety of needs on campus, but prime among them that I want to mention tonight, this is not exhaustive, but two that I'd really like to emphasize, are the creation and nurturing of an interdisciplinary community of scholars engaged both in sustaining and enriching ongoing intellectual vitality here on campus at LMU, and also in producing scholarship that will have a wider audience and impact, publications and things like that. The mission of the Academy speaks to the engagement with the Catholic intellectual tradition. And I want to take 60 seconds or so to just speak to that and encourage all of you to participate in the activities of the Academy going forward. First of all, in the spirit of Laudato Si, for those of you who have read it, I want to emphasize that while the Catholic intellectual tradition will always have a place for the foundational work of philosophy and theology, that tradition includes work in political science, economics, history, business, science, the arts, and many more. There is, in principle, no discipline on campus that is not part of this conversation. And already in practice, there's a great deal of work being done here at LMU that fits under, very comfortably, this sort of conversation with tradition. Secondly, for those who are sort of new to this conversation and this dialogue, I want to mention that engagement with the Catholic intellectual tradition can take on lots of different forms. Engagement might mean creative appropriation, comparative dialogue, questioning, critiquing, or otherwise taking seriously the relevance of the wide scope of Catholic thought. So I encourage you to find out more about the work of the Academy, to consider applying for faculty fellowships. Those of you who are faculty members, that announcement will be going out soon, and to participate in the wide range of activities that we have planned for this and coming semesters, as Eric mentioned. Finally, let me just thank a few people without whom this evening would not be possible. The support of the president and the provost are obviously something we should mention. The Academy has been a priority for the university for several years now through planning and launching. Let me also thank the deans who I've spoken with and are very supportive of the Academy's mission, and the Academy's advisory board. Let me thank also, he's here somewhere, Joe Labrie, who launched the Academy last year to unbelievable success in the spring, and also thank someone who helped Joe do that in the spring and also was really instrumental, more so than myself, in organizing this tonight, and that's Stephanie Monson, who's also here somewhere. But Stephanie really is the person who brought all this together and made it possible, and we should thank her for that. Let me invite all of you to turn off your cell phones instead of to vibrate. I will do the same here. Here's the plan for this evening. We're going to begin with a brief statement about Laudato Si from our moderator, Father Rausch, followed by brief 5 to 7 minute statements from each of the disciplinary panelists, after which we're going to open the floor to discussion. Let me say one other thing that was in my folder here. For those who haven't read Laudato Si yet, it's long for an encyclical, but it's an easier read than the reading in my classes for all my students who are here. It's shorter than that. There's a summary of some of the main points taken from the document in the Catholic Agitator. Jeff Dietrich pulled them together, and there's some of these on the table outside. So in the briefest way of introduction, I've actually got longer bios here, but if my colleagues don't mind, I'm going to skip enumerating all their many impressive accomplishments and just introduce them so we can get to the discussion. Our moderator and co-panelist this evening is Reverend Thomas Rausch of the Society of Jesus, the T. Marie Chilton Professor of Catholic Theology. Our panelists in alphabetical order are Scott Cameron, who's a Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Ethics Minor, Christopher Chappell, who's the Navan and Pratima Doshi Professor of Indic and Comparative Theology in the Theological Studies Department. Sean Devlin is an Assistant Professor of Economics. Jim Landry is the Professor and Chair of Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry, as well as Director of the Environmental Science Program. And finally, Tracy Voiles is an Assistant Professor in Women's Studies and a, what's the word I'm looking for, fellow associate with environmental studies, good supporter of that program as well. So, Father Thomas Rausch, and we'll begin our discussion.
Last week at Loyola University, one of the scholars, look at we could get kind of turnout. Laudato Si, Pope Francis long anticipated primarily about climate go off the list. So climate change is a concern. Rather, it is an encyclical on our common home, or as St. Francis of Assisi would say, and he quotes him our sister Mother Earth, who now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. It's very long, 246 paragraphs, 163 pages, or if you get it off the Vatican website, which is a terrific website, it's this fat document, but it's certainly available there, divided into 6 chapters. But its very concreteness and lack of abstract jargon makes it a very easy read. The Pope calls attention to how we have plundered and abused the earth, filling it with filth and waste, poisoning her atmosphere, cutting down the forests that purify her air, polluting her life-giving streams and oceans rich with living creatures. People get sick, he says, from insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, and agrotoxins. Each year we generate millions of tons of waste, much of it non-biodegradable, toxic, even radioactive. On top of this, there is a warning of climatic system change due to the concentration of greenhouse gases which come from our human activity. The abuse of the environment affects us all, but especially the poor, especially the quarter of the world's populations that live on the coasts or nearby, and it contributes to the massive migration taking place today, of which we're all very well aware. Many do not have access to safe drinking water, which itself is being turned into a commodity. Francis asks, have we no concern for coming generations? The encyclical addresses every person living on the planet, thus other churches and Christian communities, other religions, all people of goodwill. It wants to draw on the best of scientific research available to us today, and it acknowledges that the church does not have all the answers, and so it repeatedly calls for dialogue. From a biblical perspective, Pope Francis argues that human life is grounded in 3 fundamental and closely intertwined relationships: with God, with our neighbor, and with the earth itself. These 3 vital relationships have been broken both outwardly and within us. According to Genesis 3, this rupture is the result of sin, the sin of our presuming to take the place of God and refusing to acknowledge our creaturely limitations. The encyclical's basic point is that as human beings, we belong to one single human family dependent on each other and on the earth that is our common home. As the Pope repeats numerous times, all things are connected and dependent on one another. Time and space are not independent of one another, and not even atoms or subatomic particles can be considered in isolation. Just as the different aspects of the planet, physical, chemical, and biological, are interrelated, so too are living species, part of a network which we will never fully understand. A good part of our genetic code is shared by many living beings, he says. We need to be in solidarity with each other and to care for the earth, not exploit it. Thus, the encyclical calls for not just a heightened environmental consciousness, but a substantial change in the way we live, which means to change our lifestyles, our habits of consumption, and methods of production, all of which contribute to climate change, which is a global problem with environmental, social, and economic consequences. Africa is especially vulnerable, he says. Scientific and technological progress cannot be equated with the progress of humanity. We need progressively to replace highly polluting fossil fuels, especially coal, but also oil. He challenges what he calls the myths of modernity, that is individualism, the myth of ongoing progress, consumerism, unregulated free markets. Environmental education seeks to recover levels of ecological equilibrium with oneself in solidarity with others and with God. Thus, a spirituality more sensitive to our hurting planet. It should encourage us to reduce water consumption, separate refuse, cook only what can reasonably be consumed, use public transportation or carpooling, plant trees, turn off unnecessary lights, and so on. Some who ridicule expressions of environmental concern, many Catholics among them, need an ecological conversion. The encyclical is both poetic and practical. It reminds all to say grace before meals, reminding us that our food comes from the earth, stressing a consistent ethic of life. It is inconsistent, he says, to work to preserve animal species without at the same time being concerned about human trafficking, indifference to the poor, or being willing to destroy lives that are deemed unwanted, speaking of life in the womb. The Bible does not support a tyrannical anthropocentrism at the expense of other creatures. It teaches the immense dignity of each person. Those nations that have benefited from industrialization at the cost of an enormous increase in greenhouse gases, he says, have a greater responsibility towards providing a global solution. But the Pope is not anti-science. Technoscience, he says, when properly directed, can improve the quality of human life. Who can deny, he says, the beauty of an aircraft or a skyscraper? I like that. While advancing the Catholic tradition, the encyclical remains rooted in it. Thus, it rejects population control as a means to address the environmental crisis, stresses the unique difference between humans transcending biology and animals, even if experimentation on animals might contribute to saving human lives. In other words, he makes an allowance for that. It argues that gendered differences should be respected and differentiates God from creation, which in the Eucharist is projected towards divinization, towards unification with the Creator himself. Some of these are more controversial. Some of them may come up in our discussion. So his encyclical is a beautiful meditation on the damage we are doing to our sister Earth and calls to the conversion necessary to save our common home. So I'm going to turn it over to our panel, and if they go beyond 6 minutes, I'm going to pass this little book. It's just kind of a warning signal to them. Scott. Should we stand up? Do it any way you want. Yeah, stand up or do it from here.
Are we close enough, or do you want us to use that? Yeah. Okay, can you hear me at the back? Wave if you can. Okay, good, thank you. I've really enjoyed reading the Pope's encyclical. Today I'll mention 3 features I find especially significant. Most encyclicals address the Catholic Church on questions that are significant to her. But here Pope Francis follows Pope John XXIII in challenging all men and women of goodwill to forge a common basis for understanding and action. I found it encouraging that non-Catholic Christians, those from other religious traditions, and secular philosophers I know have all responded to Francis's appeal. Naturally, most have some reservations, one place or another. Secular environmental philosophers, for instance, as Father Thomas already mentioned, might question the Pope's resistance to talk of population control, but the Pope anticipates and engages those reactions. He doesn't merely appeal to tradition, but observes how much food is currently wasted, and that small populations with outsized appetites, read middle and upper class first world people, wreak far more destruction than large populations that produce smaller ecological footprints. As the Pope notes, there are questions on which the Church has no reason to offer a definitive opinion, since that should result from honest debate among experts. But in the case of climate change, the crisis has been documented extensively. Our problem, a moral challenge of the first order, has been to overcome our denial and to forge a broad moral commitment to action. The Pope explicitly welcomes the contributions of all moral leaders, and I'm delighted with the initiative and the courage that he has shown. Second, the Pope challenges the facile and, for the powers that be, politically convenient bifurcation that pits the religious, social, and economic conservative against the secular, social, and economic liberal. Drawing on the Church's rich biblical and theological traditions, Francis highlights the ways our duties to other human beings are integrally related to our duties to non-human creatures, and vice versa. For too many years, religious conservatives have allied themselves with conservative economic interests that exploit the least of these my brethren, those in whom Jesus invited us to meet and to serve him. At the same time, those committed to social and environmental change have often lacked a religious center adequate to motivate their discovering or to empower them to carry out the moral demands that climate change will ask of us all. This Pope has garnered much attention as a charismatic and morally committed leader, and I hope that a movement will begin to crystallize around him, as earlier movements grew around William Wilberforce, Mohandas Gandhi, or Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., not to mention the Pope's namesake saint. In quiet moments, most of us know what we should be doing, but we seem to need the moral leadership to galvanize us, to galvanize our good intentions into significant social change. Third, the Pope directly addresses a challenge I often face in the world of academic philosophy. That is, that the discipline is methodologically atheistic, and so inherently hostile to the insights of the religiously motivated. What do I mean by methodological atheism? Modern philosophy began with a commitment to reject any argument that could not be proven. In many contexts, this method was extremely fruitful. It produced modern science and reconfigured many of the traditional humanities. But the method came at a cost that I can illustrate most easily in the case of history. Contemporary historians may personally believe in God. They may accept a version even of the idea of providence, that God cares about and acts in history. But these days, no historian will comfortably ascribe the revivals we now call the Great Awakening to God's moving in our midst. Now think about that. You can't say it. Might be true, but you can't say it. This is a major change. We've always known that God was not on the side of our enemies. That's been obvious to everybody on every side of every war. But modern historians cannot ever claim, even if they believe by faith, that God might actually have preferences regarding, or even a hand in the development, for instance, of broad social movements, like those that ended slavery, or at least legalized slavery, in the 19th century, or that emancipated women in the 20th. Now, in the case of history, this restriction may still seem pretty reasonable. We're often remarkably poor judges in our own cases, and recognizing God's movement is often just another symptom of our own moral blindness. But in environmental philosophy, methodological atheism has had substantive effects, and this encyclical, I think helpfully, points them out. I will mention only one of consequence. If people want, we can discuss other ones later. As the Pope notes, only in the modern world does a toxically Promethean anthropocentrism become virtually inevitable. The three great theistic traditions all recognize the special place of human beings, but by recognizing God as the creator of all, they also acknowledge the intrinsic dignity of all other creatures. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, God creates all other creatures before human beings, and in each case, God saw that they were good. Good, that is, independently of their value of us. We weren't even on the scene. In the modern world, however, the death of God leaves us merely with values. Not a single obligatory good, something before which we're responsible and for which we ought to make sacrifices, but rather choices. Note, it's plural, the word values. Choices among which we decide what we take as valuable. In such a world, it's almost impossible to conceive a reason to put the brakes on human preferences, because even when we choose to put the brakes in one area, we're doing it because of the values that we chose, right? That we're always doing the steering. Man is, to nature's great cost, the measure of all things. I could go on, but let me summarize. Here, a Pope addresses all people of goodwill to galvanize us to action on universal and immediate moral challenges. Here, the Pope challenges the morally truncated perspective of both liberals and conservatives and calls us to develop a more honest and integral account of good and act on it. And finally, the Pope has drawn on religious wisdom traditions to illuminate the limitations of both modern and, in some cases, postmodern perspectives. To this I say, hear, hear.
This document is breathtaking in its scope. It addresses issues of grave concern: climate change, the treatment of animals, the loss of species diversity, but provides a very strong message that cruelty to animals is never to be abetted or tolerated. And he spends a great deal of time talking about the challenges of agriculture, problematizing the industrialization of agriculture. This is a document awake and alive to our troubled world. It has echoes of Teilhard de Chardin, the great Jesuit geologist, and it draws deeply in communion with the work of Thomas Berry, my own professor, who brought to our attention the need for a new story. It is deeply Christian. It is deeply Catholic, and by that, I'm referring to the methodology. It starts with an invocation of Francis, it continues with an invocation of the Bible, and then every few paragraphs there's bringing up tradition, bringing up the history and the depth of the Christian and specifically Catholic intellectual tradition, and it's deeply Jesuit. Recall that the Jesuits arose coterminous at the same time as the rise of science. And the Jesuits themselves were deeply interested in science, many of them, like Teilhard, very groundbreaking in their own research. And it's a book that reminds us of the Catholic position on Revelation. And it states in here, reminds us that the book of nature was written by God. It is to be read and appreciated by all of humanity. And by nature, we're not talking about those things we derive from nature, but nature as the source of all the goodness and abundance that we as humans enjoy. At the same time, it's very Franciscan, and that again and again, he praises simplicity. Again and again, the Pope lifts up the notion that it's not the stuff that defines us, it's the quality of our human heart within the world that makes us truly human. It is implicitly interfaith. The theology here is very, very, very large. Nothing could be taken as offensive to a member of another faith that I have been able to see. And he actually calls out the Earth Charter. Now, this to me was, oh my goodness. This is a document that I helped with. It was conceptualized by Stephen Rockefeller, the son of Nelson Rockefeller, who had been religious studies professor and then dean at Middlebury College, but took early retirement to go tirelessly through the world to all different communities on every continent and ask them, please contribute, please, let's talk about this. It sparked conversations worldwide. Many of these conversations we took up in our meetings of the Forum on Religion and Ecology. This remarkable movement, born out of inspiration by Thomas Berry, resulted in conferences, 12 of them, some at the United Nations, many of them at Harvard, inviting leaders, inviting theologians from all of the world's organized religious traditions as well as the disorganized religious traditions to resource their traditions and to ask the question, what would our faith do if it were awake and aware of the tremendous destruction and harm being caused on the planet? Now, in light of our new core, this document gives even more impetus for Loyola Marymount University to continue to emphasize engaged learning. And I've been taking my theology students for decades down into the wetlands with the ornithologists and with the insect people and with the botanists and saying, here is the book that you need to read. I've been educating them about the sycamore trees and about the oak trees. These are the species indigenous and native to our particular habitat, and inviting people to really rethink their relationship with their community. And as I teach in the spring, I'll be doing my regular course on world religions and ecology for both theology students and environmental studies, majors and minors. This document will be required reading. So I want to just give praise, give thanks, and there's a great deal of hope to be found here. Very sobering, the challenges that we confront. Thank you.
There's a switch on the back side. Make sure it's up. On the back, right here.
I just want to begin by echoing the previous speakers in my giving thanks to Pope Francis for this document, as well as all the insight that it brings to all of us. It is astounding, some of the environmental troubles that our world faces. And I am grateful that here is a document that really lays out those environmental challenges, puts them right alongside our need for concern for the poor and those who are marginalized in society. In addition to that, it puts this into a moral context. So now it is not just simply a question that we want to solve either technologically or politically, but one that we also must confront each and every one of us morally. And as has been mentioned, this was written to not just Catholics, not just Christians, but all people of goodwill. I also want to thank the organizers for this event, for the Center for Urban Resilience and for ACTI, for setting this up, because as Pope Francis said in this very document, that we urgently need a humanism capable of bringing together the different fields of knowledge. All right? So it's great that all of us are here to represent different intellectual traditions here on campus, to be able to take each of our own specialties, and to be able to look at the problems that are brought up in it from our own context and using our own specific knowledges. I'd like to think that as a member of the Department of Economics, that my perspective included is useful to bring. In fact, in that very statement I read earlier about the need to bring together different fields of knowledge, he explicitly calls out economics as being one that needs to be at the table. I really want to make sure that my underlying appreciation for this document is stated, because I have a feeling like we're going to spend a lot of time looking at the areas in which there is some contention, right? That there could be disagreement amongst people of goodwill, and that is just fine. You can still really appreciate a document even if you call into question some of the aspects of it. For example, I worry that those reading the document would get an unfair or a biased perspective on the discipline of economics. There are places in the document in which he is very critical of the discipline of economics, and some of it is, of course, deserved, but some of it might be less so. Economics, as hopefully many of you know, is basically the study of scarcity. What do we do when we can't have everything? When we've got to make real choices about how we want to live as individuals and as societies. There's a place in the document where he says that economists like to assume that there can be infinite growth, and this is under the assumption of infinite supply of all the earth's goods. This is decidedly false. Not just in its statement, obviously the earth has limited resources, but also as a central tenet of economics that we don't have infinite resources, that we can't have have everything that we want, right? And so I'd like to indicate that economics absolutely should have a place at the table, and in fact, many economists have been trying to push for the type of common sense thinking, common sense judgments that the Pope calls for in this, where we very clearly try to address the limitations of some of our actions, try to really think about the negative consequences that can happen on the environment, on the poor and the needy, and that he will find great allies in our discipline in trying to actually address these problems and try to get real action and real change coming about. I do want to highlight one of his statements that was a bit troubling. After calling for this inclusion of many disciplines in trying to address these very, very real needs, both social and economic, he includes a statement basically condemning cap-and-trade systems for trying to address climate change. As many of you may be aware, cap-and-trade systems, which try to institute limits on the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted through a series of permits and mechanisms by which they can be traded, is actually a very popular solution amongst economists for trying to enact real change. In the encyclical, the Pope states that this type of methodology can lead to a new form of speculation, and that it in no way allows for the radical change which present circumstances require. I disagree with that. I think that it absolutely can be used as a mechanism for enacting real change, and I hope that we can all keep an open mind about what possibilities might be useful in trying to address these concerns, and that each of our disciplinary perspectives can be respected in trying to contribute to the conversation in the ways that we are most prepared to do. Thank you.
Well, hello, everybody. This was a wonderful book to read, and I'm so grateful that the Pope got it out in time so that I could use it in the fall for my class. So it is one of the books that we're using in a first-year seminar for the LEAP program and really looking at climate change. So this is a wonderful book. It's very rich with all kinds of ideas. I wanted to kind of just address 4 points, and the previous speakers have addressed some things. So I'm going to skip over some of the details, because the very first item I wanted to talk about was really the scientific evidence for kind of pollution due to anthropogenic sources that the Pope does indeed point out. And we're in the season of political activity, debates, fact checks. Seems like me as the natural scientist up here on the panel, that everybody would want to know, does the Pope get the science right? And so he indeed discusses a wide range of atmospheric pollutants and their health hazards, pollutants to our water systems, to our groundwater, these done by industrial sources, climate change due to increasing greenhouse gases, due to our reliance on fossil fuels and for energy and deforestation. There is others as well, so I won't go into all of those, but the bottom line is, yes, he pretty much captures what is being said by environmental scientists, and these are indeed the environmental issues facing us with regard to climate change. But some other things that he talks about is that some of these are due, these pollutants and kind of way of acting are due to our throwaway culture, which does not really have a circular model to really kind of produce and use and then reuse materials in a very consistent way. He also points out that the climate is a common good belonging to all and is meant for all. And it's a global problem that really requires a global integrated response. When he was talking about water, he really says that access to safe drinking water is a basic and universal human right, since it is essential to human survival, and as such, it's a condition for the existence or the exercise of other human rights. And so I thought that that was very, very keen. The next point is kind of addressing a little bit of our need for a new look at the human relationship with nature. And so Pope Francis really tries to tie together the need for care of the environment with care for the poor. And this is a recurring theme that keeps coming up. We need to abandon our old ideas of dominion over nature, which emphasizes us being separate from nature, to one of connectedness with nature and with each other. We need to move away from consumerism for the sake of consumerism, and look at minimizing our use of resources, employing only what we need. We need to think more about the people that are going to follow us. We need to move away from individualism to one of looking out for the common good. And we need to reconnect with nature. I like to ask people to really make nature part of your worldview. And so the third point is really then, how do we move forward? How do we change our worldview to become more environmentally responsible? And what he proposes is an integral ecology. It's all about having a better understanding of where we come from. And I think there's a lot of tools now that are available, just that coincidentally have come on the scene in the last 10 to 20 years. You know, one is this big history movement, where really we describe the history starting at the Big Bang, the beginning of the universe, and we look as what's happening as we move through physical, chemical, biological evolution. And now, again, in words that Professor Chappell brought up, Teilhard would talk about this as a spiritual evolution as well. So this integral ecology is, it's very interdisciplinary in its approach to solving the problem. It needs to take a larger look at things, the bigger perspective, and this is something that we're only just beginning to do. Our history of looking at things have been very reductionistic, breaking things down into small pieces so we could understand what was going on. But now we're using more holistic approaches, and ecology is a really good example of that. We're looking at the bigger pictures. This ties together with complex systems, where complex systems, the more complex something gets, new properties emerge that really have no meaning when we're looking at the small pieces and only come into focus as we get larger in our analysis. He talks about developing an environmental, social, and economic ecology. And this to better understand our connection and involvement in the natural world. And finally, that these things need to be done at every level. The individual level, the family level, communities, cities, states, nationally, and obviously globally. The last point that I really wanted to talk about is kind of this interface of science and religion. And I've been very fortunate to have been involved in the science and religion dialogue for quite a few years now. And, while some, and I would argue that it's actually a very few, think that science and religion are in deep conflict on most issues, I think most other people realize that faith and reason are much more in dialogue. This is especially true of cooperation of scientists and religious organizations in trying to make us environmentally aware, and this movement has been going on for quite a while. I find the approach proposed by Pope Francis, namely that of an integral ecology, that it builds on many of the Jesuit ideas, such as finding God in all things, which is our reconnection with nature. The emphasis on social justice and environmental justice, which is their connection for the care of the earth and the care of the poor. But even more, his approach to science and religion seems to be an integrating approach, very similar to Teilhard, also someone who I enjoyed learning about when I was a student in college and have continued reading about him, who wrote about this a long time ago and tried to do this synthesis 80 years ago or so. We must all integrate science and religion aspects to truly understand our connectedness with each other, the earth, the universe, and God. And the ultimate meaning of our existence has an outcome that reunites us all to God. So in conclusion, I found the encyclical to be very exciting because it supports the work of many in the environmental arena who are working tirelessly to move us to be more sustainable and a resilient society that cares for the earth and all its people. It has the ability to move environmental responsibility from still kind of a fringe, on the margins activity to one that all people can get behind. And also here in our LMU community, we can really embrace what we're already doing and teaching, finding God in all things, educating the whole person, and working on the promotion of justice. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to try to keep my remarks brief and not be delivered the book and thereby be cut off. And I look forward to our conversation. In her groundbreaking 1986 essay, Who is Your Mother?, Indigenous feminist theorist Paula Gunn Allen makes a case that throughout Western history, many of our most generative and passionately held intellectual traditions actually derive from indigenous thought and practice. Our cherished tenets of liberty, equality, and democracy, to more contemporary ideals such as gender equality, social justice, and environmentalism. Our best ideas, in short, have what she calls red roots. These red roots, I think, are very much in evidence in this profoundly transformative and beautifully written encyclical. It seems to me in the opening passages, the Pope is paying heed to indigenous knowledge of the natural world, its crucial role in our lives, and its more than economic value. The integral ecology, which I think Jim just discussed very nicely, that's proposed here honors the worldviews that Native nations have long maintained. In doing so, the encyclical does crucial work towards dismantling the hierarchical and endlessly destructive binary the Western world has wrought to separate humans from nature. It also moves the church in the right direction, not only in terms of more sustainable ecological teachings, but also in terms of validating indigenous ways of living and knowing. This is good. Indigenous peoples in the natural world have been tied to one another through their own land-based worldviews and through histories of colonial violence that linked eradication of native peoples to the profiting off of environmental degradation. The improvement of environmental conditions, particularly in the world's most vulnerable ecosystems where indigenous people tend to live, means better lives for native nations that currently face rampant resource depletion, the disproportionate dumping of noxious waste, and changing climate conditions that make increasing numbers of indigenous people climate refugees. This is also right in line with the Pope's call to address the environment on behalf of the poor, since Native people make up 30% of the world's poorest, despite being only 5% of the world's population. So herein lies the most generative contribution of the encyclical, to my mind. It situates environmentalism as a matter of social justice. And this is a central tenet of the environmental justice movement, which defines the environment as wherever humans live, work, play, and pray. Those of you who are in my environmental justice class, say it with me. And environmentalism is a movement to protect the health of humans and non-humans alike. Indeed, the Pope's insistence that we must hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor could be taken directly from the environmental justice movement. Welcome, Pope Francis, the environmental justice movement. As members of this movement can attest, this encyclical is a desperately needed contribution. The majority of people engaged in this movement are women, people of color, the indigenous, the poor, people of global South nations, and what activists like to call the South of the North, denizens of inner cities and reservations, prisons and domestic violence shelters. For them, environmental activism is not a luxury. They don't have the privilege of hemming and hawing over whether or not environmental problems matter. Environmentalism is quite starkly a necessity for those who live life on what political theorist Denise da Silva calls the horizon of death. The Pope here gives credence to that urgency, and he does so with an eloquence that borders on poetics. So, what does all this talk of environmentalism, environmental justice, and an integrated ecology have to do with women? I'm the women's studies professor here on this panel. Especially because women's rights aren't explicitly addressed in the document, except for a brief mention of reproductive rights, which I think someone brought up at some point, and I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A if we have more questions about them. So the first part of the answer is easy. Women make up 70% of the world's poorest people, so when we speak about justice for the poor, we must also speak of women's rights. Moreover, women in poverty often live on the front lines of environmental harm, be it from climate change, rampant pollution, food shortages, or resource extraction. Environmental decline targets women disproportionately, despite the fact that women are rarely in charge of the environmental decisions that so impact their lives. So if women are not explicitly addressed in the document, it does address womanhood in ideological terms. The opening passages give glory to nature as the sacred feminine sister to humankind, our kin rather than our servant. However, as ecofeminists would probably very loudly point out, to glorify nature as the defined feminine is not the same as being a feminist. Being associated with nature, particularly being symbolic of or deemed closer to nature, has often been prerequisite to domination and exploitation. Women's historical association with nature, to be sure, has been tied to their subordination. This binary opposition of social, cultural, political, economic, and even spiritual roles, with women in nature on one side and men on technology on the other, has long undergirded Western social organization and cultural and political hegemony. It is in this way that social injustices are of a piece with the ruination of the non-human natural world. To subvert that hierarchical binary between humans and non-humans, as the Pope does in this document, should be of interest to feminists. Elevating nature to the realm of family rather than property cannot help but disrupt the binary between masculine and feminine. Thus, in ideological ways, we can see this as a step towards women's liberation, which I think would be a surprise to a lot of feminists, finding an environmental document coming out of the Vatican. I think there is feminist work being done here. And finally, the encyclical proposes a better and more sustainable relationship between humans and the earth, one that has the potential to make human and non-human life better. It implicitly recognizes the value of indigenous worldviews. However, I just want to say a note a little bit about the text as a living document, the text as it lives in our political world. Even as this document is released, and even as Pope Francis has made very, very welcome speeches about the role of the history of the church in indigenous life, the church is simultaneously engaged in activities that contradict the commitment to justice for indigenous people, even as these changes to its environmental politics have the potential to be a force for good in Native people's lives. A timely example of which is the impending canonization of Junipero Serra, which a lot of Californians know has been quite controversial for Native Americans. If the Pope would like to strengthen the commitment outlined in this encyclical to indigenous worldviews and to environmental justice for the poor, a disproportionate number of whom worldwide are Native, I would suggest that it is difficult to do so while also institutionalizing the sainthood of a man that Native peoples regard as a symbol and agent of brutality. As scholars, as we all are, following a Jesuit intellectual tradition of the encouragement of learning and the promotion of justice, I think we can and should both celebrate this evolution of church teachings on our relationships to the natural world and think critically about how we can build forward to a world that continues to integrate our highest ideals of faith and justice. Thank you very much.
I want to thank all our panelists for their appreciative and probing and insightful comments. I think they were really very helpful in helping us probe more deeply into this encyclical. Now we want to hear from you. We don't have microphones here. Maybe we should pass these, but I'll ask you to stand, and if you want to make a comment or ask a question. So we have some reactions. Yes.
Sure. So you're just, how does that come about? Is that kind of what the question is, or it's the consequence? Well, yeah. So and the Pope actually addresses it in the document. You know, I think he makes the point that about 25% of the world's population lives near the coast, and so when there is rise in water levels, it's certainly going to affect those people very quickly. And I think of those, it's a higher percentage that are poor. And so, and that ties together with what he was talking about before. So I don't know, I could go on for a long time about rise in sea level, but I think those are the things that were brought out in the encyclical.
You know, Matt, I would say that's the first creation story. The second creation story, God says, care for this earth that I have given you. So you have two different perspectives in the two different creation stories that the book of Genesis gives us.
Can I take that on? The most famous article in environmental philosophy is Lynn White's The Origins of the Ecological Crisis. He was a UCLA historian and medievalist, and his claim was very famously that, and by the way, he actually describes himself, the last page of the article, as a churchman, so he's not like, there's not just like shooting across the wall. But he says Christianity is the most anthropocentric religion that the world has ever produced. And that's a really famous argument. Everybody knows it. Most people accept it. And if you look at the argument carefully, the argument bears evidence within it of its own, inadequacy. So essentially what happens is that White says, well, the creation story says, we've been given dominion over Earth. And his question throughout the article is, why, the starting question is, why is it that the environmental crisis happened in the West? And his answer to that question is, well, the West was Christian, and it goes back to the creation story. But the trouble with that story is this. First of all, it's a Jewish creation story. And it's not, this is not a problem in the Jewish tradition. It's a creation story that's shared an essential structure by the Islamic world, but the Islamic world didn't go in this tradition. Finally, in the argument, in the article itself, White points out that the Eastern Christian tradition, which is fully half of the Christian tradition, right, didn't go in this direction either. So in my view, actually, it's bad history because using Mill's methods, right, the cause is there and the effect is there, you might be okay, but if the cause is there, the effect is not there. If the effect is there and the cause is not there, you got a problem. So the question I think has to be asked is, why was it that in Western Christianity we started interpreting dominion as domination? That's the question I have. And I think the answer is pretty obvious. It's a philosopher who says at the end of the book that lays out the program for modern philosophy, if we pursue this method, we will create a new science that will make us lords and masters of nature. Christians read that. They wanted to be good scientists. They wanted to be good moderns. And they started to interpret their own tradition in that light. And I think that's the best reason for thinking that, yeah, this idea of dominion, it certainly did spread, and it spread within the Christian church. But when did it spread? It wasn't there at the beginning. It was there later on. And why? Well, this idea is outside that we started using to interpret our own tradition in ways that I think are toxic. So that's my history, yeah.
Okay, I'd like to, first of all, praise the Loyolan for the cover story. This was investigative journalism at its best. And I'm referring to the suppression of the water bottle, okay? It was brilliant. So, rah-rah, Loyolan, okay, speak truth. Second, work in the garden. And third, get involved with the Center for Service and Action. And get involved with all of the resources that we have. I mean, we're nationally recognized for our goodness in terms of recycling and for solar energy generation and on and on. And I was just so thrilled when I saw that really wonderful coverage that was, you know, speaking truth to power. And if you haven't read it, the Loyolan's right out there. It's an amazing article.
We got a question in the back.
National discourse on this issue, like all the arguments for either recognizing global climate change, not doing something, I think even the cap and trade. Are we going to commodify pollution? Allow the rich to generate a lot of it, and so my question is, is there something new in economics that would cause to challenge the criticism that focuses more on the common good?
Yeah, thank you. So as I mentioned in my brief introduction, some of the criticism is deserved. I think that economics has been used to try to institutionalize some of these dynamics where, you know, the environment is disregarded, where the poor are oppressed, and people will oftentimes give economic explanations for why they want to do that. I do want to draw a distinction, though, between the way that economics is frequently used in the politics and in the popular media from where the discipline is. Even in the encyclical, Pope Francis writes that that he's talking about certain economic theories which today scarcely anybody dare defend. No one believes this anymore, that the idea that markets will automatically correct themselves in all circumstances, that all we need to do is have a laissez-faire capitalism and things work out just fine. No one actually believes that now, except for possibly a scarce few, but of course that doesn't keep those justifications from coming to the lips of those for whom it serves their interests. The subdiscipline of environmental economics, or if you look at environmental ethics or social justice within economics, all of these care very deeply about some of these negative ramifications that have come about. And I think that it's easy to sort of set up economics as a kind of scapegoat, because obviously so many of the problems that we face have economic components, right? If not even primarily economic concerns. But just as you don't blame doctors for there being certain diseases out there, I don't think that economics as a discipline should should be blamed for all the economic problems that exist in the world, right? These are problems that we all need to face, hopefully with some good education, with good understanding of economic principles, so that we can get sort of the most just, most effective mechanisms and institutions that we can muster.
I knew somebody would. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you for that question. I'm quite glad that you asked it. So, the only way in which this enters into the encyclical is that the Pope makes sure to make a note that coming down in these different ways, weighing in on the politics of environmentalism, that he very firmly does not agree with an environmentalist critique that population is a problem, right? That population is not as important as overconsumption, which is a point that I agree with. However, historians and feminists have long argued, and this is one of the central critiques, especially of indigenous feminist theories, that women's power to control their own reproduction is an environmentalist politics. It's a deeply, deeply environmentalist politics for a number of different reasons, not just in terms of the number of bodies on the earth, but also women's ability to make economic decisions. So in a very material way, women's reproductive justice is absolutely central to an environmental politics, right? Especially because one of the key features of any of my courses or any feminist work on the environment is looking at the ways in which environmentalism is a social justice politics, and it is also feminist, right? So the first thing that I tell my environmental justice students on day one is that if you are someone who is here because they care about racial justice or because they are a feminist scholar or engaged in gender equity, you have to also care about environmentalism, and vice versa. Those of you who are here because you feel that you are deeply invested in environmentalism, you can't do that practice without also caring about social justice. Reproductive justice is a central part of that. So both in material ways, but also in ideological ways, in the ways in which if we are giving glory and dignity to the Western world's others, people of color, non-humans, women, that dignity includes personhood, that dignity includes choice, reason, all of those kinds of faculties. So I think it's an important question. That's how I would address it. Many feminists would address it in different kinds of ways. That's what I would say.
Right back there. Yeah. You know, I think that was one of his central themes in this encyclical. We have too many Catholics that have dismissed this, not just Catholics, that have said, what's the Pope doing talking about science? That's not his area. He should talk about, morality. And so there's a number of things to say there. First of all, he has, as someone used this term, Dr. Chappell, I think, integral ecology. I think that's a wonderful term. And he sees it as something that involves far more than the environment. It involves our social relationships, it involves the poor, it involves our intellectual life, and so forth. Secondly, I think it's very important to focus on what he says about changing our lifestyle. This is quite radical in this encyclical in terms of consumerism and materialism and this pursuit of wealth, mindless pursuit of wealth. He really is calling for a real change of life, and that is very difficult for a lot of people to accept. So I think some of the opposition is because they see where the rubber hits the road on this, that he really is asking us to change, not just to be concerned about the environment, but to be concerned about the way we live, which is what, of course, affects the environment. So, there's a lot of things we could say about that. Finally, he has this clear sense that we belong to one human family and that we are related to all the other living species. That's another beautiful idea. He says we really share a common genetic code, with all living creatures. And we haven't really figured out what that means, and that's one of the challenges I think he's offering us. Okay.
5:45. I know there might still be some questions, and I invite all of you to bring your questions with the panelists up to the reception that's going on up at the 4th floor. That's right outside 4404, where the causeway comes across with the new lounge area. Hold on just a second before you go. Two quick announcements. One, I'd encourage you to go to the website for the Academy for Catholic Thought and Imagination to look at the other events that we're sponsoring or co-sponsoring this semester and into next semester. We hope that you'll continue to be involved in this sort of conversation, which for the entire academic year is going to be framed or in dialogue in some way with Laudato Si. And finally, join me again in thanking our panelists and moderator for their expertise.